Hey, I'm Harrison Telion,
And I'm Agree Ahmed.
and this is Bottom Line Design.
And today we're going to be talking about the single biggest and most important design asset you need. It's the first one. It is your design system.
Mm.
Um, Design systems kind of blew up with like material design, I think, in 2014. It's now kind of becoming more ubiquitous, I'd say, among startups and anyone really who's building a product, is that they want something that gives them a ready-made language that can express, interfaces, oftentimes things that are consistent with their brand. And, maybe we should hear from the resident designer about what the benefits are of adopting a design system.
All right, but then I'm going to come back to you because we built a design system together
We did.
at Clara,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of work to be done before pen turned into pixel. A lot of conversations. I
Oh,
remember
yeah.
most distinctly that memory of us locking ourselves in for like two
Oh,
or
yeah.
3 days, kind of coming up with like all the different various patterns that could be
Right.
used in different parts of the app,
Yeah.
and like you almost codifying the type, things like that. So yeah, I think one thing that I would start off by saying is a lot of times people will confuse brand guides with design guides.
Yup.
So what is a brand guide? A brand guide are things like, actually we just got off the phone with someone where we were talking about this. Like a brand guide is about typography, the messaging that's okay, the imagery that's okay to use, like logo lockups,
Right.
colors, fonts, things like that. It's like the look, the aesthetic, but it can't always backfill into product or portals or services that you're
Right.
designing. That's where a design guide comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think like is maybe that's the best place to start.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I think like design systems, they make it so that you have your Lego blocks for your interfaces, and if you have those Lego blocks for your interfaces, there's a pretty good chance that you probably are going to be using them all the way up into your marketing collateral. I think like what you were saying about the difference between a brand guide and a design system is that brand guidelines are sort of like a brand book. What's different, I think, is that they typically are made for companies that don't have a digital interface component to them,
Yeah.
right? You see a lot of sort of like hype beast brands, I think, and like especially in New York City, it's very much like you get onto their website and you don't even really know what's going on, and they're not trying to like let you in on what's going on.
Yeah.
Those people do not have like an app dot blah 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 collective.com section that you sign in with Google, right?
And what are they trying to do? Like, what are they trying to communicate if not to pull you into an experience to convert? Like, what are they trying to do?
I mean, it might be like, for example, like folks that are sort of like in the scene with like, let's say like EDM, or they're like really like hyper creatives, or whatever that is. That's a little different, right? And those guys, those brands have consistent brand values and things that come through aesthetically on their the not interfaces, but I guess like the visual things that they make.
Yeah.
But that's a little different from you have a product, right? Your product, like if you could launch it on Product Hunt, chances are, and there's like a login button, chances are you need a design system. You don't need brand guidelines. You need a design system.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think like another big benefit, besides the consistency, is that it reduces the time it takes to produce designs, like actually physically, like not physically, but create them.
Yeah.
Instead of being a Figma interface, it's actually like a button, right? You don't have to spend as much engineering effort getting everything done.
Actually, just stopping right there, like a lot of times we'll come in and we'll say, okay, like as designers, like we want X, Y, and Z designed this way. Well, the engineer still has to build that, or the team has to build that. So what happens then? Well, the engineer is going to kind of come back to the designer and say, hey, this can be built or this can't be built. Like, for example, React. React as a framework is great. You can do a lot of cool stuff on it. It does not handle diffuse shadows very well. right?
Right.
So whereas you might have a diffuse shadow and a logo lockup from a brand identity, that brand identity actually can't be pulled over into the product to make a diffuse shadow card to house like an
Mm-hmm.
image and some text and maybe a CTA.
Right.
So speaking with engineers before you even get started on a design guide, it's critical, because you can understand their capacity, their limitations. Time also plays a factor into this. If you have like all the time in the world,
Right.
a design guide is fairly easy to make. But if you don't have a lot of time in the world, like most founders, most companies, most designers don't have, you're going to want to start off with the most essential patterns. So where do you look for those patterns when getting started?
It's like it's easy to overthink this, and probably easy to think that you should just copy whatever some 600 million billion dollar like tech zaibatsu like megacorp is doing. I think that
They did it this way, so then we did it.
yeah.
We'll have to do it this way.
Right. And I mean, there's like a few key components I think that every design system needs. Every startup trying to implement a design system probably needs. It's worth noting also here that there's a lot of great stuff that you can just pull off the shelf. Figma has some great community files.
Totally.
A lot of open source
Totally.
Figma files for design systems, even ones that you can just like copy the file, you can clone it and then upload it to your library, or upload it as a library inside your project. And now suddenly there's all the components that are in that file are usable across your Figma project. But if you're looking for sort of like the first aid kit or like the sort of the bare bones, the essentials of what you would need in any design system, you're probably going to need like color wise, you a lot less than you think. You just need a primary color, which is like what color the button's going to be when you need to go to the next action. You'll need like
Secondary.
a secondary color, right? Yeah, that's like sort of like I guess I mean when you're saying secondary color, what are you thinking of? Like,
so basically, what you want to do is you want to look at it from a branding perspective. You want to look at the different colors that the brand is using. So if they have like 2 or 3 colors in their logo, you're going to want to talk to the founder and say, okay, like what is the primary color? What's the secondary color? What's that tertiary color? And then you have maybe supporting colors, and those supporting colors can be different shades of those first, primary, and tertiary.
Right.
But it goes way past that real quick.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
in what ways does it start to take on a life of its own?
I mean, it's like, yeah, you can have so many different colors, and then you get into sort of like problems with color theory that you may think that the dark version of the color or the light version of the color is just a linear distance in terms of like darkness, but because of like weird quirks with the human retina and the way our color cones actually process colors, you can't linearly or on a single sort of like algebraic axis, you can't simply do like 10% darker, 20% darker, because we perceive shades of darker colors. We can perceive those nuances more easily than lighter colors. So it gets yeah. It gets like out of hand. Yeah, this is a huge problem, by the way, in like designing data visualizations, is figuring out the palette. Because data people are numbers people, and they have to actually like there are special functions that are made that allow you to linearly traverse the human perception of color, and that linear traversal, because the human perception of color is like more nuanced in the darker end and less nuanced on the lighter end, it's like it gets out of hand really quickly. But yeah,
and actually, just to that point, you bring up a good like segue into accessibility. So like a lot of times, we might find like, okay, a logo has like a lime green and a dark blue. Well, a dark blue is super legible, right?
Yeah.
You could throw that dark blue on a CTA
Right.
with white text, and you're going to get like a high conversion.
Mm-hmm.
If you throw lime green up against dark blue, which we've seen,
yeah,
you're gonna have a bad time because your user's gonna have like retinal vibration, right? And can you just like tell everyone why it is that that's a bad bet, and why it is that we always recommend to companies to just distill down their colors to maybe like more accessible tones?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's a lot to say on this subject, but like when it comes down to your design system, you want your brand, I think, like incorporating or as an input into the design system, but the boss here really is usability and accessibility. And so some of that comes in also in terms of like leaning into existing paradigms. One cheat code that you can totally steal is the way Bubble, the no code tool, thinks about your design for colors. And they have a list of colors. I might miss a couple off the top of my head, but like every Bubble app, you have to specify what these colors are going to be in that app's design system. So they already have like a sort of design system out of the box, and the colors are the primary one. So that's like what your next button's color is going to look like. Another is the error or catastrophe color. This is like sort of when like a request fails or somebody put in like the invalid password is a sort of common example. Another is the alert color, which is like a sort of like hold up, wait, you're thinking probably like the color yellow. Yeah. Right. And then yeah, I think that there is like a sort of a secondary color which you can do for like sort of lower priority CTAs. And then that's just on the color side.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I feel like, we could spend hours on color, but like really like kind of coming back to the design system, color is a good example of where brand and product break apart. Right? Because you might have a company that starts off with a brand identity, and then they want to build a product, and they want to bring that brand identity into the product. Well, okay, that's fine.
Right.
And you can get lucky sometimes with like good accessible colors, maybe like an open source font that got chosen that's not like $16,000 from a typeface foundry.
Oh yeah.
Having like no fallback font. But really what ends up happening like 9 times out of 10 is companies will get a graphic designer to make a brand identity, or they'll hire an agency to make a brand identity, and then when they go and get funding or they have like a growth spurt and they want to build out product, they lean on that brand identity, and then they start seeing where it breaks down.
Right.
Where is it that we saw it break down in our experience?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have seen some horror stories in this department. I think like the most common one is like, I mean, I don't even really understand the mindset for this. And I don't understand how the sales process for this works, because just the decision that you would make for this is so foreign to me, that like a startup gets pitched by like an advertising agency or like a creative agency for
happens a lot more than you might think.
Like the quotes I've seen, I mean, like the lowest I've seen in this department is $80,000.
Yeah.
I've seen, for the sort of the really famous ones, we don't want to name any names here, but like I've seen like $250,000 invoices for brand guidelines that they're told like, oh yeah, when you look at it, they're just shoehorning. This agency sort of like specialization is billboards and ads, like subway ads in print, and they're just shoehorning the experience that they have, like sort of selling like ad collateral, shoehorning that into digital interfaces. And they're coming from their perspective. The colors are always like a little bit too poppy to be interfacing. I remember like seeing,
sorry to interrupt. Part of that comes from the decision team, right? Yeah. Like a lot of the times, like we'll find marketers are having a huge say in these branding discussions. Right. But again, while they're great, maybe isolated, right, maybe for like a one pager or like some collateral or that billboard.
Yeah.
It breaks down. And the places that I've seen a brand guide break down when trying to pull it into product, retrofitting it into a design guide, are things like CTAs, things like error states, things like input fields, or potentially like card states or graphs, where color is important, nuance in shape, form factors is important. You also have to realize that the web has many, many different screen sizes. So a lot of the times you might find that a certain font header does not really, like a serif font will not squeeze down to a really, really tight area of the screen like a sans serif font would.
Yeah.
Right. Or maybe a computer is a little bit older than the ones that we're filming on, and you need a fallback font. Well,
Right.
if you chose, you know, Helvetica or Arial, like you're okay. But if you chose something where you maybe paid a foundry like a few $1,000s, that system, that may not be a system font on your next lead, or it may not be a system font on whoever your website is looking back at.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that like if you go in that direction, just be very cognizant that the brand guide that you get, like you're gonna have a bad time. There's gonna be a lot of sort of like remorse, I think, if you try to shoehorn your brand guide into a design guide.
Yeah.
And it's just probably like our nature that we tend to think that product is the boss, and so it's very difficult for me to imagine.
A lot of times she is.
Yeah, for sure. And as a result, it's like I feel like any day of the week you ask me, I would want a design system before I had a brand guide. Again, a little different if, like, let's say you're a direct-to-consumer founder or you're a direct-to-consumer startup where a lot of this is going into things like the packaging or the email collateral. A lot more of the stuff that you're doing is visual. It's not strictly product design or interface design. But if you're doing stuff with interfaces, really start with the design system first.
Yeah.
And I just want to give a couple shout outs to some good ones that you can look at for inspiration. They're open source. The first one, obviously, the most famously is Material Design.
Thanks to Arte.
Yeah.
Design director at Google.
And wasn't Material Design kind of like the first real design system? It's certainly the first one I got introduced to.
So I really think like BlackBerry was,
really?
Yeah, I think BlackBerry was one of the first ones, because BlackBerry was this weird in between where they were going from the flip phone. The Razor had just gotten released, but the Razor was still using like a bounded flip phone UI. The BlackBerry actually had some UX considerations, and they had to repeat patterns. The moment you start repeating a pattern in your services or your product, that is the start of a design guide.
Yeah.
You have to codify what that pattern is, document it, and then propagate it in places where you'll find it. So if you have a chevron indicating both forward, up, down, and left, you're not going to want to create an arrow suddenly telling someone to go right. You're going to want to use that same chevron in the reverse direction for your back icon, or maybe like a tapper that turns up and down a volume.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that those repeatabilities, it's like Material Design is kind of like a famous one. I would say that,
and then Apple, I think. But I think Material, what was nice about Material is they put design systems on the map.
Yeah, for sure.
And they are, to this day, the most comprehensive. They are, they address every single use case super, super well, from breakpoints to CTAs, how to use them, filled, unfilled, color appropriation, composition, text layout, how many characters you should be using in a line before your eye begins to feel fatigue. Like, there are so many considerations.
Yeah. And I think that, like, because of how comprehensive it is, if you're gonna look to Material Design as a jumping off point for your design system, your best bet is just take an open source implementation off the shelf rather than trying to re-implement all of it yourself and readapting it to your brand. That's sort of like trying to boil the ocean, drain the swamp. Like, don't do it. Material UI is kind of like the famous one here that they've got. It's a React library that you can use, and you can customize it. You can customize the colors and certain aspects of the styling and things like this to be more aligned with the visual.
But you're building from something, not something. You're not building something, you're building from something.
Yeah, precisely. I think that, like, also a lot of product people, they may be a little bit hesitant to use the Material Design system or pull that right off the shelf, because it does kind of make your product feel like a Google subsidiary, just because obviously it's like base for
Yeah.
them. And
Yeah.
it's still the case that like a lot of, you know, the design system, like what distinguishes one design system from another is visual, and it is kind of connected to the brand. You can tell an Airbnb product or an
Yeah.
interface from a Google interface, even if they're showing you like the same thing of like listings. I don't know, you know?
You know, it's funny. I'm just now remembering a story from way back when. I think it was like 2015 ish.
Mm.
Anyone out there that can like correct me, like please do down in the comments. But like, I remember distinctly, Google Material did not account for iOS designers that wanted to use some of their stuff.
Oh.
And for a very brief amount of time, there was the local back button,
Right.
like the native back button on Android.
Yeah.
And then there was also a top left corner.
Oh,
back
I remember
button.
this. Yeah, this was such
and
a thing.
If you tapped both, they did the same thing.
Yeah.
But eventually, what the Google design team came up with was, hey, we're just going to reveal that local back button, that like that high level back button when it's appropriate. So I think they must have done this programmatically, but if you were in an app that did not require you to go back a page, the local would show up. But if you were in a page where it was like really drilled down, then you could access the top left corner back button.
Oh, yeah.
So design systems change, you know, and I want to just actually spend a little bit of time with that, because what you're going to find is whenever you're building a product, you're going to come up with different use cases, and you know, your pattern's not always going to be applicable, and so you're going to have to be able to backpedal just a bit and see where is it that pattern broke, and is there a solution that brings the best of the existing pattern so that the rest of your like design guide doesn't fail, and bring it over into that new use case. But be prepared for change, be prepared for iteration. The design guide document is a living, breathing organism.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that like the open source design languages or design systems are very good at addressing the vast majority of cases that you're going to run into. And you know, it's the same way, like a startup doesn't invent a new programming language to build its product. It just takes an existing language off the shelf. It's kind of a similar thing with design systems. Obviously, every one of the open source ones you can mod and kind of give it your flavor and your guys' approach color wise. Figma, I think, even does come with a design system like out of the box that you can use when you like set up a library or clone a library. I think you can like customize it. And with that being said, by the way, this is sort of just like a shout out for the engineers or the people who are interfacing with engineers, hopefully all of you, that when you're trying to build a custom design system, if you're trying to like implement a system that's been thought out in Figma, but sort of make it come true in code, especially if you're working in React, you know, my recommendation as an engineer would be that, first of all, you should be in a mono repo. And this is, you know, if you're not an engineer, don't worry, you might be able to fast forward through the next couple seconds, but like you should be in a mono repo. You should have a component library that's a package within that mono repo. And that component library, ideally, the way you have it set up is that each of the modules that you're exporting is a human legible component. Or so don't call it like, you know, like an H1 or whatever, it's like a heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, human legible component names. And the styling of those components, you can style them under the hood, implement them as Tailwind, right? Or if it's in React Native, if you're not in React but you're in React Native, you can do React Native's sort of like their inline styles, or you know, the right way to. I haven't caught up in that community for about a year now, but like how whatever is happening in React Native land for styling components. And the goal here, what you're trying to do is make it so that when you're building these interfaces, you're calling the interfaces not by their low level name of like, this is a div with the following Tailwind styles, or this is a text component with the following like layout, because that's just, you're defeating the purpose of the design system. You're taking all those advantages that come in Figma and you're not bringing them over to your code base. Instead, just be like, this is a heading 1, this is a heading 2, this is a primary button, right? Or this is a button where the theme is the primary theme rather than the caution theme, whatever. And what you get is a really fast way of building interfaces, and the code ends up being really readable. And now the designers and the engineers, they're all talking the same language, right? That when the designer's like, oh yeah, this is going to be a heading 1 to start off the screen, as the title of the screen, the engineer just has to, crack open their VS Code or, wherever they're coding and just say like, okay, this is a screen component, and at the top of it is going to be a heading 1.
Sometimes there's cultures, unfortunately, where engineers and designers aren't really set up to have a good working relationship.
Yeah.
I think you and I were super fortunate to have the relationship that we built. What were some components that we what were some areas that we practice on in our own working relationship to build out that first design system, maybe at Clara, let's say?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And how did we establish what was enough to get started? And this is maybe a question that other founders or designers are looking to have an answer for, because it can be, if you were to go onto my site, like, harrisontaylor.com, check out my design guide. It runs deep.
Yeah.
But that was over 4 years.
Yeah.
Right? What about if I'm a company just getting started?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is like why I keep finding myself coming back to this, like the open source design systems that are really high quality. But like in terms of like figuring out what was enough for us, it really just boiled down to like the few things that I think all product focused startups kind of need, which is like you need a finite palette, finite color palette. It can't be too many. You maybe have 3 states. If you want to talk about like what your disabled state looks like, just like 54% opacity. That's a cheat code, right?
Google material.
Yeah.
12, 26, 54, 87.
There you go. Yeah, we've committed that to memory. That's in every design system we've built together, pretty much, that we've used. So yeah, there's the opacity levels. There's the finite number of colors. There's like 3 kind of like font sizes of like the heading class, where there's like probably like 3 subclasses of that. Like biggest is H1, and then finally down to the heading 3. And then there's the subheadings, and then there's the body text and maybe caption.
And then how about the components as well? How do you know how do you know that you've built enough of a design guide to actually propagate it within the product team?
Yeah, I mean, I think that everyone needs buttons. Everybody needs text components. Everybody probably is going to need form fields, because you're going to be interfacing with a keyboard. And then beyond that, it really ends up becoming kind of use case dependent. If there's no notion of time in your product, you probably don't need to think about the calendar, right? If you're a booking app, you definitely need to think about the calendar. If you are a photo upload app, or if you're dealing with any sort of like document upload, download, you're going to have components for that, and they're going to have to be standardized as well. Open source systems tend to have, especially the more robust ones, tend to have all of these use cases covered. And you can kind of pick and choose which of these you're going to sort of adapt or restyle as necessary, but you don't need to boil the ocean. I think that a lot of like what you're saying of like what was necessary, what was enough, it's just driven by your product roadmap, right? And like what functionality your product needs to support.
And what are the roles at a company that are part of designing this guide?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think that the Holy Trinity is, somebody who owns a product, somebody who is designing the product, and somebody who is coding or building the product.
So a PM, engineer, and designer? Yeah.
And sometimes that's all one person.
Yeah.
It can be a little bit torturous to, have to run the entire 100 yards from end to end. But yeah, I think that those 3 people or those 3 functions working together kind of get to set the parameters of what's necessary, right? Yeah. What other recommendations do you have for pitfalls to avoid? What places do you see founders and startups normally getting kind of caught in a tar pit when they're thinking about their design systems?
I think it kind of just goes back to what you were talking about before, which is trying to build something from scratch. You know, it's really, really gnarly when you have, and this happens a lot, and it's to no fault of the founding team. I think it's just a mixture of like misguided passion and also not knowing about the tools that are out there.
Right.
That's when your engineering team is making design decisions while they're engineering. And that can be very, very difficult. And
awful.
It's extremely expensive. Why? Because you're basically turning that engineer into a ratio. Not only do they have to implement, but they now also have to take in all these other considerations. We keep on calling me back to color, but I swear design system is not just about color type, composition, CTAs, what should the bevel be on that CTA. It's just like, why even burden the most expensive resource of 2023 with design as a consideration as well? You know, you basically want to set up your engineering team for success, and a lot of that starts with pen before pixel. Pen before pixel is your designer and your engineering team and your product person coming together, establishing what patterns exist today and designing for those patterns first, putting it out into the world, and then making sure that it actually sticks. If it sticks, great, keep on iterating from it. If it doesn't, great, at least now you have a framework to iterate from.
Yeah, and I think that like the visual, like it's really easy, I think, to get trapped in the mindset that because all of this stuff is happening on the computer, that all of it is kind of the same or interchangeable work. It's like, give it a more physical sort of like analogy or allegory. It would be like having somebody have to do the design work while they're implementing in the engineering, which, by the way, this is the number one reason to have a design system, is so that you avoid this. It's such a problem that it's like the whole design system exists to not have to do this, because what you're talking about is like the software equivalent of basically like if they were in construction, it would be like somebody working a jackhammer while having like a pencil in their mouth because they may need to adjust the blueprints in real time, right? They like start jackhammering, they realize, oh shit, okay, actually that's not gonna, here, let me erase this like corner out here, and like we're gonna have to have the door come out a different direction. And it's like, dude, you're literally like working like a piston to like destroy like the concrete foundation or something, right? Like, why are you also like tweaking and fiddling with like the game plan, right? It's like a design system gives you a way of describing a game plan that as it's being executed will not run into itself. And that's kind of why it's such a potent secret sauce.
And on that note, I think that's it from us.
Yeah.
You're going to come to experience a lot more analogies from Agree. He is chock full of them. There's a side story, but fun fact, we were able to document all these little clippings of what Agree had said over like 4 years.
Harrison's a very good gift giver.
And then we were able to like produce a little book of it. But now we have this channel as an archive. So anyway, thanks for joining us. If you guys have any questions, comments, feel free to drop a comment below. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys. Take care.